All right, good evening, everyone. I am the Reverend Daniel Schultz, the Wisconsin Council of Churches Community Health Program Director, kind of a mouthful. And I am very glad to be here with you tonight to talk about keeping community, COVID and disability. Actually, I think we made that disability and COVID, other way around there. I know we have a couple people watching the webinar right now, and I'm sure we'll have more folks listen to the recording later. We're going to get down to some discussion between the panelists, and thank you, my panelists, for waiting patiently for us to get rolling and for being willing to be here with us tonight. So we're going to start with some introductions. And I told you who I am, and we're doing image descriptions tonight. So I am a balding, middle-aged white man with a beard and glasses, if that helps you understand who I am. Let's start with Sarah McKenney.
I'm Sarah McKennie. I reside in Bloomington, Indiana. I am the spiritual support coordinator for Stonebelt Arc. I am 36, long dark hair, dark brown hair, and white. So in my job, Stonebelt is a nonprofit service provider that provides a variety of different services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And my job is kind of like a spiritual case manager to help figure out, learn what each person's spiritual needs are, and then help connect them to the community to make sure that those spiritual needs are being met. And then I do a lot of training and educating congregations around the area on how they can be more inclusive of people with disabilities. That's me.
And we're going to go from left to right, according to my screen. So next up is Russell Ewell.
Good evening, everyone. I am Reverend Russell Ewell, and I am an ordained deacon in the United Methodist Church on purpose. I always say a deacon on purpose. And so I actually, though, I serve as the senior pastor of Terrace Lake United Methodist Church in Kansas City, Missouri. My entrance into disability is I self-identify as a person with a disability. I worked for years as a community development director of community development for a Centers for Independent Living. I have worked for the Department of Rehabilitation Services prior to going to seminary, and after that into the ministry full time. And so my life is as an advocate for people with disabilities, and I continue that in my ministries today, and advocating for people with disabilities, advocating for people who are coming through the process, particularly for ordination as people with disabilities, and for people who are in our congregations, who are people with disabilities, who are looking for a way to get more involved in their churches and to be empowered. And so that's my short version of who I am. So I'm sorry. And so I am also a middle-aged, I'm an African-American male. I have a goatee, a beard, and I'm wearing glasses. Yes.
All right, thank you. Jacob Nault.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jacob Nault. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am from I'm currently working in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. I am the licensed sabbatical minister at First Congregational Church in Oshkosh, and I'm on the ordination track in the United Church of Christ. Um, and my entrance into disability um, is through my own lived experience. I was diagnosed with a disability at birth, and also I do some work with the United Church of Christ Disability Ministries Board, sharing music and worship resources. I am also a freelance musician, a composer, a pianist, a singer, and so part of my vocation, in addition to pastoral ministry, is writing music and other worship resources for the church around disability. And an image description, I am a late 20s white man with glasses and blonde hair, and I'm wearing headphones tonight.
Very good. I should mention that I also am part of the disability community, or identify as part of that. Not nearly to the extent that other people face challenges, but I live with mental health challenges, and so I certainly place myself on that side of the line.
And
Well,
I did not mention that in mine, but I too am a person with a disability. I have dyslexia and struggled and have lived with neurodiversity my whole life. And part of my story of how God brought me into the position I am in now.
you know, unfortunately, I think it's easy for everyone to kind of forget about those invisible disabilities. And I will, I'm sure we'll talk about that a little later on. So let me throw out some questions for us to chew on here. And the first is probably the most obvious. How has the pandemic affected people such as yourself, or the people that you work with?
I can start. So at Stonebelt, we support, like I said, about roughly 2,500 individuals through various services, anything from residential supports to mental health, to job supports, to spiritual health. And I would say the last 2 years has really brought about what I've seen as a big, really spiritual health crisis. We have a lot of the people I work with know and understand God through experience, through actual experience. They experience God. That's how they know God. So that being physical, social, connectedness, relational, and so there's less of this reliance on intellectualized understanding and knowledge of God, but instead knowing God through love, touch, presence, kindness, connectedness. And this has been very difficult to and just not been met the last 2 years, especially with social distancing. Even masks really can really have an effect on how people visually can relate to one another. But then even not being able to leave your house, not being able to visit with friends, family, go to their job, these things that are a lot of the people I've worked with have been working their whole lives toward. Some people know what it was, have lived in institutions even. And so to have all of this, all the ways that they reach purpose, value, worth in their lives have been very much limited. And that I've seen have a big impact on people's spiritual and mental health.
Has the do you feel like the anxiety has really increased with the people that you live with or work with?
Anxiety, yes, to a certain extent, but I would say less about the virus and more about now that they're starting to be able to connect with their friends, there's a fear of when it's going to be taken away. So really connected to loss, grief, and not having control over any of those decisions. And that's a really loss of empowerment to a group of people who've not experienced a lot of empowerment in their lives.
Sure. Okay. We'll come back to that. That's a very important point. Russell, I wanted to ask you this question in particular because I got a phone call from another visually impaired pastor the other day who heard about this webinar and wanted to call and tell me all of these challenges that he and people like himself had faced, some of which I'd never really thought about. Testing centers for COVID are heavily driving dependent. So if you don't drive, it's a real challenge to get in. He mentioned the home tests not being accessible.
Yeah.
And having done a couple of those, and you got to rip this and then tear this and put this in here and that. It was a nightmare for me, and I can see relatively easily. I can't imagine if you were visually impaired trying to do that. And video conferencing, of course, can be a real challenge. So I heard about all this, and I thought about you. Does that ring any bells?
It does. So just even in my own personal experience with going to a conference where we were in DC, and every night you're supposed to test and submit that test electronically, the copies of the test, results of the test, so that you could participate the next day. And I have to tell you, I had to do a dry run with my wife. And I had to remember basically how to do the test. And so we do find people who are, it's frustrating. I know, like, literally what might have taken someone 5 minutes to do it, it took me like an hour to do that test because of fear. But also the technology. And so what I'm also finding is that there are people who, particularly when it comes to, and I know we're going to get to this later on, but when it comes to trying to accessing church and worship services that may have just now specifically just be online, it is difficult for people. And even those who, when churches are back now, and people, because they have pre-existing conditions, they are not really nervous about going back out again. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear, and their ability to be able to access the worship services is very difficult because they may have other disabilities as well. And so I'm familiar with people who say that even if you will assist me to find a way to get the technology, because of the functionality of my disability, because I'm losing my sight. I might be able to hear it a little bit, but I can no longer see what's on the screen. Or there are those who are now deaf-blind, and it takes a while before you even get to that, for people to admit it, that they may have been deaf already, but now they're losing their sight, or they may have been blind and now they're losing their hearing, and they don't want to admit it. And so we're finding people that are very disconnected from churches, have not been back, are finding it very, very difficult to be in community with one another, because community is so large. And so because of that, we're finding a lot of people who have become feelings of isolation, feelings of depression, and even some that have just been traumatized by the pandemic. And so we're working hard to try and to find ways to get people connected to the community again.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of folks from the disability community talking about this feeling of being forgotten
Yeah.
and overlooked, neglected, even more than they were before the pandemic. And it becomes a very real kind of fear for them, because they're afraid that the health policy is going to be set in such a way as not to take their needs or vulnerabilities into account. Well, go ahead. No, I'm sorry. I was going to pass it to Jacob. So if you have
No, go ahead,
anything.
Jacob. I'm fine.
So I think there's I resonated with a lot of what Russell shared, but for different reasons, and because I have a different kind of disability. Like the COVID tests aren't accessible to those with motor disabilities either, because of like I had to have whenever I took a COVID test, I had to have somebody do it for me, and like have somebody actually put the thing up my nose, and that was not a not a fun time. It's not a fun time to do a COVID test by yourself, and it's even less fun to have somebody else do it to you, even if that person is a trusted, supportive person. It's not particularly fun, and not being able to drive. At first in the pandemic, when everybody was at home, like if we wanted to meet on Zoom or whatever, it was there wasn't the added barrier that I experience of like, I have, oh my gosh, I have to ask someone to pick me up if we're going to go somewhere, or I have to ask someone to meet me where I am instead of me going to where they are. And I think as we reach sort of this different stage of the pandemic, where vaccines are more available, tests are more available, pills and other treatments are more available, and people are starting to quote unquote move on from COVID. Some of that has come back, where it's starting to get exhausting for me, and I imagine for other people who don't drive, to navigate the fact that the expectation is we're back in person for everything again, and it's sort of like, okay, have we learned anything over the last 2 years?
Right. I hear a lot of churches talking about wanting to keep the option of online worship, maybe not exclusively,
Right.
but at least keep that as an option. And
Sure.
honestly, I do wonder how long that will last, or if that will be something that people sort of gradually give up on as not worth their time.
Or money, because that's another consideration of often if your church has one license, for example, which is the licensing company that if you want to use any other music other than like what's in hymnals or whatever, there's a separate plan for that.
And sure, and it's more expensive if you're doing that online, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
Yes.
All right. Well, so tell me, if you will, and as I ask these questions, don't be afraid to respond to one another and go back and forth. How is it that your communities have processed some of this stuff, the fear, the trauma, the grief of it all?
You mean like the disability communities?
Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry. Or your church.
So I know as far as with the United Methodist Church, with the Ministers with Disabilities and with the Association of Disability Ministries, we've been very intentional about checking in with each other, very intentional about having Zoom calls, Zoom check-ins once a month to help to process and to think through what are some of the situations that you may have run into that your churches may be dealing with, and just an opportunity for people to be in community with one another, because that's huge. Again, for some people, getting out and getting them and in the midst of COVID, it's still kind of fearful. My wife and I actually, we are some of the few people who still continue to wear masks when we go out now, because I have pre-existing conditions. And so one of our biggest fears is for me to get COVID, is because of my pre-existing conditions. And so we continue to wear our mask, and then others who I know, they continue to wear theirs because of this fear. But if you don't have others who are around who can help you to unpack that, and for you to know that you're not the only one that's dealing with it, it can be very detrimental. So yeah, that's one of the ways that we're dealing with that.
Sure.
So for me and Stonebelt, but also the community in which Stonebelt lies within, Bloomington and the surrounding areas, there's kind of a variety. I immediately think of a variety of different things. I mean, I do a lot of grief support for a lot of the individuals we support, and we have seen a lot of physical health decline, mental health decline, and like I said, spiritual health decline. And I think a large part of it was after isolation, the impact of depression, loneliness, how it heavily impacted people's physical health as well, which has been really interesting to see all of those, all of the kind of really mind, body, spirit at work, and how intertwined it is. And when one is not well, how it highly impacts the rest. But so I have been doing a lot of grief support for the people with intellectual developmental disabilities that we support. But I will also say that there's been also a lot of work within the faith communities in the area to try and build some of, kind of work through some of those fears as we, because really I'm trying to get faith communities to start supporting people with disabilities again. Somebody mentioned transportation being a big thing, and that also goes for people with intellectual developmental disabilities, many of whom, not all, but many of whom struggle to are not able to drive a car, and so they rely on transportation of others, and we are so chronically short-staffed that people with disabilities do not, well, the people that we serve that do not have transportation to their faith community. So trying to equip faith communities to help try and provide that transportation for their congregation members is always been a bit of a struggle, but even more so now that there's that fear of being in the same space for too long. And so even just kind of building up some of that trust, and well, how do we put some safety precautions, or how can we talk through this to where we can kind of still connect and get people connected with one another.
I think the isolation has been compounded by the fatigue of, like, man, this thing feels like it never ends. All these new variants are showing up, and at times we see people who don't believe this is a real problem, don't believe this is a real virus, would rather work for their own freedom or their own individual rights than the communities in which we are engaged, and the ways that the virus continues to affect our daily lives. It just feels like it's never going to end, and it's so hard to think about that, and there's a great deal of fear there too.
Well, there is an author whose name is not springing to mind right now, but who talks about how our economic participation gives us a place in society. And so when you can't get to work, or you can't go out and go shopping, you're just sort of pushed right out of society.
Right.
And I would say, to add to that, I mean, it does have the economic connection, but what do jobs provide? That's how a person finds their purpose and their value, literally monetary worth. And if and not that I'm in favor of thinking of it that way, but that's often how it's perceived, is my money, my time, my gifts are actually of value. And again, for people with disabilities, especially those with intellectual disabilities, who really were out of, and still are, to a large extent, struggle to find jobs to begin with, and then to have those taken away and not be able to do that has been, it really connects to a much deeper set of questions of who am I, what am I doing here, what's my purpose, what do you want me to do, God? How do I still utilize my gifts, my God-given gifts, with everyone else? Really, some core issues come up.
Yeah, lest anyone think we're being too materialist here, of course, participation in the church community or religious life is
Absolutely.
it's sort of an alternative economy, if you want to think about it that way. where your worth is not measured by money, but by how well you can connect with other people, and just by the love of God. And but if you can't get there, and you can't use the video technology to participate at a distance, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Well, that seems like a good segue into my next question, and I hope our followers here will feel free to drop their own questions at us. But sort of on a concrete level, what do churches need to think about as the pandemic continues, or as it maybe comes to an end, hopefully?
I think definitely to be intentional about, as my dear sisters spoke about reaching out and making sure that we find ways to connect, and finding ways to make sure that we are perhaps providing transportation for people with disabilities to get into a space, to get back into community, because that's one of the things that I hear people talk about, is that the feeling of loss of community, which goes along with what she was talking about with loss of purpose. I feel better when I'm able to give to others. I feel better when I'm able to serve. I feel better when I'm in the midst of my sisters and brothers working together for a common cause. And so when people are alone at home and unable to do that, it does bring about, again, depression and a loss of who am I, and trying to determine who am I. And so churches have to really take the onus on ourselves. One of my biggest frustrations with pastors, and let me just be honest, and with clergy, is that you will hear people say, well, if they needed help, or if they wanted some assistance, why didn't they just call? That's the onus should not be on them. We are servants, servant leaders, and so a part of that leading is to be a servant. And so from my perspective, it is the church's responsibility to reach out and to find those who are, we love to use this language, the least, the lost, and those to leave the 99 and go to get the one. But do we really do it? And so this is a perfect opportunity to prove, are we really going to be the church that we say that we are, who we are? And so let me get off my high horse.
Well, let me ask what
you.
that looks like specifically. So Russell Ewell is sitting at home and would really like to get to church and join worship. What does your church need to do for you in the midst of this pandemic?
To check in on people, to find out and hopefully, prayerfully, those relationships would have already been built. And so it would have been just an extension of something that was already in place. So that if we were, if so-and-so is missing, if using myself again, if Russell is missing and you have not seen, you have not heard from him, then someone needs to reach out and to find out how can we be of service? How can we assist you to get back to church if that's what you're interested in doing? Are there other needs that you might have Do you need assistance getting to the doctor's office, or the assistance getting, or even finding ways to get transportation to get to those places? How can we be of service?
I like
And
how you asked the word how, you used the word how, and you're asking the other individual. There's not assumptions being made. It's not whether a person can or can't, but what do you want to do, and how can we support you in order to make that happen? One of the resources, I'm a very practical resource person, mainly because I work with a large variety of congregations, and they want to see it. They want to see a concrete example of what that might look like. And Dr. Eric Carter has in his book, and I'm going to forget it, but he is a great resource for congregations to use. And it's exactly what Reverend Ewell mentioned, and it's a survey. It's a questionnaire that you could hand out to every single one of your congregants, which would also, you might realize how many of your congregants actually need support to achieve their goals. Some of the people that you don't know have disabilities or need supports, but it's really an open questionnaire of what things are you interested in doing in this congregation, and what supports, what are your gifts, and how can you help other people and serve this church, and then also what are some challenges that you have that you need support from the rest of the community. And for people who need it, there's even like an action plan on how to make those needs met at the back of that. And I would even say, if heaven forbid we shut down again, or there was a new pandemic, that, handing those out, reassessing, hey, what do you all need? Where are you at? How do you want to participate? Also share one other short story. We had a woman who her church did not reach out, and she still wanted to have an active role in her ministry, and in her church. And so she picked up her her church phone book, and just started calling people and checking in with them and to see how they were doing. And luckily her gifts were recognized, and now she's an ordained deacon in her church. But this was something that she just decided to do because she missed that connection, and she figured other people were missing the connection too.
Yeah, I think that one thing that the wider church could do is to cultivate a theology and a practice of interdependence, with the understanding that we all have ways that we crave being in community, and we all have ways that we rely on each other. The notion for such a long time that was that, and I think still is to an extent, that people who don't have a disability or a mental health condition or something like that needed more things than quote unquote normal people. There's a facade that everybody else is independent, but those people over there are not. And I think that kind of thinking harms us as we think about what it means to live in community.
That's interesting, Jacob, that you're saying that. Where I thought you were going with at at first was to say, well, the regular people, the families with children and the young adults and teenagers and whatnot, they have needs, and then those people with special needs, they have extra needs, right? And we really want to focus on the one because that's the future of our community. When the truth is, when you really get down to it, right, we all have the same need, which is to be loved and provided for by God.
Yeah.
Right. That's what the church is all about. We have a question here from Karen Betzig Lundberg, and Karen, I'm sorry if I butchered your name, who asks, how do we include the immunocompromised vulnerable in person when many congregants view the pandemic as over and no longer wear masks or take precautions? I have an answer, but I'm going to make you guys try first.
I think in some ways, in some ways I have my misgivings about this, and I'll get to that in a second. But I have a person who I know that that has cancer, and people in my church community understand this person's situation and the impacts of the cancer on their life and those kinds of things. And so people who are in close proximity to this person in the worship space will wear masks because they care about this person. I wish that my misgiving about it is that that we have to put a face to it in order for it to be real, because I think that it is real. It is real for so many people that we don't know, and for all we know, any person, any visitor who comes to our worship spaces, if we're worship leaders, any visitor who comes to our worship spaces could be immunocompromised, and we wouldn't know. And if for example, the church I serve is mask optional, which a lot of people think is great, but it also that also creates more risk for those folks who are immunocompromised or have underlying conditions that that would make them especially vulnerable to COVID. And so I just really it really does something to me spiritually and emotionally when people, if not by their words, by their actions, will sort of say that the pandemic is over when there are very real consequences for people in our communities. And for some people, we do have to put a face to it, which I wish we didn't have to, but that seems to be what the response has been.
That was powerful. My experiences have been similar. we too, at the church that I serve, there are several people who have cancer. And again, like you said, because of there's a face, and people love that person, or those people, then they will wear masks around them and they're quote unquote kind of like pods. But this church boasts of everyone whom they know of that's there, is vaccinated, double, triple vax. But again, as you say, the people who come in our doors, we have no idea. And if they are immunocompromised, we have no idea. One of the things that I continue to say is that I'm wearing my mask because I love you. My wife and I are around a lot of people. She's also a pastor of a different church, and we are around a lot of people all the time. And you may feel comfortable, but I'm not comfortable because I don't know if I could be that pastor who brings COVID to my church. And I had just made an announcement literally 2 weeks ago about that. And my wife and I, we went on a short vacation. We came back and she tested positive for COVID. And so I think it really hit home to them because I just made a statement about that, why we continue to wear a mask, because we don't know if we can bring it to you. We have no idea. And so then too, like I said, she tested positive for COVID. So Jacob, you're 100% correct. I wish that there was another way. And I think that was what the pause was from most of us, because that's something that's really difficult for people to try and process. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think you had a really good clue in there, Russell, when you were talking about checking in on people and how churches should be doing that anyway. And I think that's where that answer lies. If your church doesn't have the kind of connections with one another that you can say, oh, Mrs. Smith has cancer, maybe we'd better be taking these precautions to protect her, then you need to develop that level of awareness with one another, about one another, if you possibly can. And I'm sorry if that sounds kind of snide, but that I think that just points us in the right direction. So it might be tough now, but the next time this comes around, you can say, "Oh, okay, we know who the really vulnerable people are in our congregation, and we know what we need to do to protect them or to bring them closer to us when they need that." Well, we are running up on the hour here. Good conversation going on. Brianna Illinois, our technical coordinator, threw out a good question for me that I'd like to wrap up with, which is, tell me a story of glimpsing God or God's kingdom that you experienced within the disability community, or as a person with a disability during the pandemic. Where'd you see the kingdom at work?
So I definitely did. I saw the kingdom at work, kind of in response to what we've just been talking about. I see the kingdom at work with people who care about one another, particularly in the congregation that I'm serving now, checking in with one another, finding ways to make sure that people are taken care of, finding ways to make sure that people are feeling a part of the congregation, feeling a part of this community, have not lost track of the love for one another, making sure that people know that they are loved. Um, the congregation that I serve, um, I think I am the youngest person there. I am, yeah. Well, let me take that back. Yeah, there's a couple of teenagers, but as far as adults are concerned, I am the youngest adult. And they are very good at taking care of one another and making sure that each other is loved. If there are needs that need to be met, they will make sure that they meet the needs. And so for me, that is definitely a way that I've seen the kingdom being enlivened in or kingdom enlivened in that particular congregation.
I guess the question really, if you want to pose that theologically for a Methodist, it's what takes the place of a potluck when you can't have a potluck, a church dinner.
And you know that's huge, right?
Yes, I know, I know.
That is huge, and that has not been easy, mind you, because that's so important to our theology. It really is. A round table, yeah, that's been so important to this particular congregation and Methodist period. But yeah, we're wrestling with that. Yeah, we really are. Yeah.
I saw glimpses of the holy in the midst of encountering other folks with disabilities. I became a member of multiple disability theology and disability in general discussion groups that talked about how we are how we're seeing the holy in the experiences that we're having, and how we're supporting each other. It's just there was a sense of community there that I didn't know existed. I didn't know other people. There were other people like me that wanted to talk about this sort of thing, and there's a particularity about the discussion of the lived experience with disability that you can't explain to somebody else. You can't you can only explain sort of in your people only understand it if they also have a disability. And so it's like there's a particular there's a particularity to that discussion, which the fact that we could have those discussions helped a lot. And then also the church that I serve, I've been very thankful because people immediately offered me any help I could possibly need right away when I started serving there a couple months ago. And I feel very blessed by the people that I serve.
I think for myself, one of those stories I keep going back to is a congregation, I think up in northwestern Wisconsin, who decided that there really was no pressing reason for them to come back together in person. Nobody was really clamoring for that. They had enough money to keep things going. And so for 2.5 years, they have been meeting online, even when, people were sounding the all clear and saying, oh yeah, you can come back together in person. They just said, it's not safe. And we're comfortable doing it this way. Wow.
So I guess my story is going to be similar to Jacob's, and I'm kind of transitioning out of my role as the spiritual support coordinator for Stonebelt and more into my own experience. Like Jacob, I over the years have found various groups realizing that there's a whole disability and spirituality field, and have been a part of some of those groups for a while now. But I think I was actually just before COVID, started a doctorate of ministry program at Western Theological Seminary in the disability and ministry studies. And what has been a joy throughout that is there's 8 students, and 7 of the 8 of us have disabilities ourselves. And that it has been a blessing to undergo this study while each of us have very diverse disabilities and overall experiences of disability. We, like Jacob was saying, there's just this element that you just can't quite describe. You can't necessarily put into words the experience, but just this kind of constant subtle marginalization all the time, experiencing in a world that's you're constantly having to do your own thing, or at least you feel like you're doing your own thing, in a world that isn't always designed for me or some of my other friends. And so it's been a joy to go through this DMIN program with other people with disabilities and dive into text, dive into conversations. It's strengthened my own relationship with God, but I've also now, and of course God's now shown me lifelong friends that has that we're connected to, not just within the program, but yes, this kind of shared experience that we're walking through together.
Is that in Holland, Michigan?
It is.
Have you been mothered by Lisa yet?
Lisa's one of those lifelong friends that I was talking about. Her and I talk at least once a week.
Is that Lisa Heffernan?
Yes.
Yes. Lisa couldn't be with us tonight. She had some difficulties that she ran into and had to cancel out at the last minute, and I know she felt terrible about that. So we do miss her and her mothering. All right, last words from anyone. If not, I think Sarah's words are an excellent place to close us out. And we hope and pray that God will indeed bring us closer to one another's hearts, even in these stressful and divisive times where the challenges are many. Thank you, Sarah McKenney, Russell Ewell, and Jacob Nault for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you, Brianna Ilway, for throwing the switches and answering the questions behind the scenes. Thank you all, and we will talk soon, I think. Bye, and
Blessings,
thank you
everybody.
all for joining us.
So much.
Bye now.